It was such a, for lack of a better word, traumatic and difficult to try to choose which baby, which image of which dead baby should I put in this report today. It was horrifying. And there were a lot of images as well of, fragments of US bombs next to civilians. And I would show, look at this US complicity. The US complicity is undeniable.
Hala Rharrit is the first American diplomat to publicly resign in protest of the Biden administration's support for Israel's war in Gaza. With an 18-year career at the State Department, Hala most recently served as the Arabic language spokesperson. And she joins us now to talk about her decision. Hala Rharrit, thank you so much for speaking to us on Real Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Mohammed. It's a pleasure.
Hala, I wanted to start, there was this quote that I read for you in an article. You said that the Biden administration's policy towards Gaza really changed your career plans. Can you elaborate on this? Let's start there, your decision to resign from the State Department.
Yeah, well, it was a really agonizing decision, Mohammed, I can tell you. So I joined the State Department 18 years ago. Not to age myself, that was straight out of grad school. So basically right out, my entire adult life. I studied international affairs, Middle Eastern studies, my undergraduate degrees, master's in Georgetown School of Foreign Service, very traditional trajectory to join the State Department. And being a diplomat was my dream job, to be honest. I felt like if you want to see change, then you make the change happen. You join the system, you go inside government, you make your voice heard, you advocate. And so for me, I felt like I could do that effectively for the last 18 years. And with this particular policy, it was such heartbreak day after day to see the administration continue specifically to funnel unconditional military assistance, which was killing so many people in Gaza, and the unwillingness of the policy to shift. It sort of shattered my belief that you can change things from within. There's a certain extent that you can. And then I began to feel complicit because it was clear that the policy was not changing.
You started to feel complicit.
I did. I began to feel complicit because once I realized that I was not able to change the policy at all, then from that point on, I began to feel complicity. Because before that point on, I thought, well, I'm here to try to make a difference. I'm here to try to shed light upon what's happening in Gaza, maybe only if the policymakers understood, maybe only if they realized this. But after a while, and after me making them aware and things were still not shifting, it became clear that there was no more role for me in government, that it was more important for me to resign and speak out. And thus I decided to change my course of career.
That's an interesting point that you raise, Hala, because I interviewed Lily Greenberg Call not too long ago, who you may know, who resigned from the Department of the Interior. And we were talking about the idea of, that she wanted to give it a shot to basically see if she can change something from the inside. And then when she believed that she couldn't, she decided to publicly resign. This whole idea of trying to change policy from within government. What does that even entail? Where do you start?
That's a really good question. So I'll give you a little bit of an insider's peek at American diplomacy and how it works. So when you become an American diplomat, you choose what your path is in terms of your field of specialty. So I was a political officer. You can also be a consular officer, which is in charge of visas and American citizen services. You can also be a public diplomacy officer in charge of educational exchanges and press. I was political. So in political, we're the ones who write the cables. We're the ones who usually work on the more sensitive issues on bilateral relationships. And we're the ones who also make policy recommendations through our cables and our reports and are in the meetings, in the government official meetings. So I worked in Yemen as a political and human rights officer. I worked in Qatar as well, leading the political and economic section. So you're able to do a lot. So in Qatar, I helped launch a bilateral economic policy initiative between the US and Qatar, for example. In Yemen, I got a lot of funding to support human rights advocates. Like, you feel like you're doing something with your job at the embassy, right? You're pushing things one way, you're advocating for things one way. You're obviously still under the administration, so you work within that framework. But I always felt throughout my career that I was doing good definitely more good than harm, right? And this was actually my last role, was actually my first public facing role. I was a spokesperson for the State Department in the Arab world, based in Dubai. So you can imagine it was never an easy job, right? To be the face of the American government in this part of the world. But honestly, Mohammed, I was honored to do it. I was proud to do it. I felt like I wanted to show a more humane face of the US government. I wanted to highlight the good things that we were doing, including at that time, now it's ironic to say this, but at that time, surging humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians, for example, or the work that we were doing on Sudan to try to broker a ceasefire again back, a few months ago. But when it came to this policy, once we got the talking points from Washington, for me, they were they were a non-starter. So I actually refused to do interviews on Gaza from the very beginning of the conflict, because from day one, really, they were so dehumanizing to the Palestinians that I could not, in good conscience, go out on Arab television and promote this talking point. So I pushed back on the department. And that goes back to sort of trying to influence. So I thought pushing back on the department was eventually going to affect a certain level of change. It obviously didn't. I ended up resigning, and getting in a lot of trouble before my resignation because I refused to give interviews on Gaza and was accused of refusing to do my job and all of this crazy stuff that happened.
I
But
can only imagine going on Arabic television and, basically saying those US talking points in Arabic. I can only imagine how they would have been received.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we know how they're received, right? They're not well received. It's all
Yeah.
generating a backlash. And that was my point to the department. And I was writing, instead of doing interviews, I was writing daily reports to Washington, basically documenting, look how our talking points are being rejected. Look how they're causing a backlash. Look how what they're indeed doing is generating an increase in anti-Americanism, which is a threat to our own US national security. Again, bringing it back to, this is a threat to America. And as an American diplomat, that was my focus, right? And of course, talking about how inhumane the policy is, how immoral it was, and how it is actually illegal. It's violating so many US laws that we continue to surge weaponry. But it was a very strange time in the department that I was so vocal. And for the first time in my career, realized actually that comes at a cost. Because I've always been vocal. I've never been shy about sharing my perspectives based on my professional experience and my expertise in the region. But with this particular policy, it was basically, put up or shut up, just basically do what you're supposed to do. And that led me to my resignation as well.
Going back to what you're saying, I take it that there wasn't one singular event that made you want to resign. It was a cumulative buildup.
Indeed, it was a cumulative buildup. I can tell you that there were many, many things that happened where I would say, okay, I can't handle it anymore. Okay, this is it. Like this is I have to resign. There's no way. And every time I would hold on a little bit more hope and say, okay, it can't really be that bad. Our policymakers can't really, really keep doubling down on this policy. And again, I kept on sending those daily reports, and that was giving me some hope, at least, that I was doing something. But the department asked me to stop sending those reports in January. So then after that, it basically began. I figured, okay, it's the time for me to resign. And it was a very lengthy process to resign, as you can imagine, after 18 years. So that's what led us to here.
And what kind of repercussions before even publicly resigning when you were pushing back?
It was a bit of a mixed bag. I had some folks back in Washington express support and even some express admiration for my quote unquote bravery, although I don't consider it brave to, just I was very much stating facts. I was never stating opinions. I was reporting about events that were happening on the ground in Gaza. It wasn't but even shedding light on those realities was considered brave, which to me was a bit perplexing. But I was also very much sidelined. I was very much silenced. I was taken off of emails in a quite systematic way. I was excluded from meetings. I was excluded from briefing senior officials that normally I would absolutely be briefing. I was excluded from other things. There was a lot of pressure on me to get back on air on Gaza. I was, practically forced into going, but I never did a single interview. Again, not because I personally disagreed with the policy, but because fundamentally I was documenting as an American diplomat how this policy was hurting US interests, not helping them. Um, I was very much aware of how I would personally be labeled as an Arab American, that I would particularly have some type of affinity that other diplomats may not. And so I was quite systematic in how I documented everything. Nothing came from my opinion. Everything came from the field, from Pan Arab media, from Arab social media, to document the repercussions of our policy, thinking that this sound logic would have some type of effect. But unfortunately, it didn't. I was told, even after my resignation, I was told your reports went to the most senior levels of government. They were read, they mattered, but we all see what's still happening in Gaza, right? We see it with our own eyes. So it's devastating. It's devastating. But since my resignation, I'm continuing to do advocacy from the outside. So hopefully, with everyone's efforts combined, this policy will eventually shift one way or another.
You resigned in April, right? And I'm
Yeah.
curious if someone said, why did it take you 6 months to resign? Is it
Yeah.
because the environment now is a bit more easier because a lot more people are speaking out against, U.S. policy on Gaza?
That's a very, very fair question. I'll tell you, there are two reasons why it took me so long. One is the hope that things that I was doing and things that other diplomats that I knew were doing were going to affect change in the policy. Because normally, our policymakers in Washington listen to their diplomats out in the field, where they're subject matter experts. We provide them feedback, we provide them information. They take that into consideration and they affect policy changes based on that. At the end of the day, it's the president, it's the secretary of state that make the decisions, but it usually us as diplomats feed in to their decision making process. And I knew that it wasn't just me. It was diplomats across the region that were shouting, basically, this is such a dangerous policy on so many levels. Please change course. It is hurting us in every way, shape, and form. So, based on precedent and based on how policies were affected previously in my 18-year career, I was holding hope that, okay, we're going to be part of the change, and I have to be part of the change. When I started speaking to some very senior diplomats about my thoughts on resignation, they kept on telling me things. Now more than ever, your voice is needed, Hala. Now more than ever, we need you. We will amplify your voice. You cannot leave now. If you leave, who else will fill your void? Who else, if you leave now, then Washington won't even hear the perspectives you're sharing. And so that made me feel a sense of guilt for even wanting to resign, right? They said, you can't abandon the government now. And so I held on hope that, okay, maybe I am needed on the inside. And then that eventually was shattered. But
Why do you think this was being said to you? Do you feel like now, in hindsight, do you feel it was some
yeah,
sort of strategy, some sort of illusion? Why do you think you were being told this?
look, I think no diplomat wants to believe that what they're doing on a daily basis does not matter, right? I think every diplomat wants to believe that they can affect some level of change or some level of influence. Um, so I think people were sincere, in their insistence to keep me in. Obviously, I went public, so it was really very much in the department's interest to keep me in. And I think everybody realized that I would go public because I was literally a spokesperson before I resigned, right? So I don't know where there's some interest to trying to keep me in to keep me from going public. Perhaps I don't know, but I want to believe that whoever was trying to keep me on the inside was sincere about it. But second, Mohammed, honestly, another reason why it took me so long is strictly logistics. It took a very long time for me to submit my resignation and to follow through on everything because being a diplomat sort of takes over your entire life. It's not just a job. So I was living in diplomatic housing. That means I had to find a new place to live for me and my entire family. The housing market's quite expensive. That took a while.
Mm.
It took a while, and it was an extremely stressful process just because once I made the decision to resign, like I wanted it to be done right away, but I couldn't. because I needed to find housing. My children's education is rolled up into my job because the embassy was providing payment to my children's school. Even our license plate was a diplomatic license plate. I had to go to the equivalent of the motor vehicles registration place and switch up. That tells you all of the little tiny things that need to get done, but it adds up to a lot of things and lots of paperwork. So it took me a while to even logistically be able to finalize a resignation. So between sort of holding on hope and being very busy in trying to affect change from within, and then once that I realized that wasn't going to happen, then putting that into effect in terms of how do I actually resign, it took a while to do that. And then once I got keys in hand to the new house, literally I was like, okay, that's it. Now my family's going to have a place to live. We've got that sorted. Time to move on to the next chapter of my life.
If we try to take a sneak peek into the State Department, what were the channels that were available to you to express discontent over the policy?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple channels depending on where you work, but I mean, every channel that you would think of in any normal job, sort of emails, phone calls, right? There are a lot of working groups, whatever working group you may be in, but also more officially, particularly in the diplomatic corps, the State Department, we write cables.
Right.
So you must have heard of the dissent channel cable. Those are reserved for exceptional circumstance to express dissent. And then there's also what we call front channel cables, which are just cables from the field reporting on whatever X, Y, and Z topic. So it was all of those channels.
Can you give an example of some of these discussions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would reach out to sort of those folks that are my mentor and ask them about the policy. Do they think that it's going to go anywhere, that it's going to shift at all? And they would always tell me things like, we have to try. We have to try. What's strange is that it was very, very rare to run into anyone that was actually in favor of the policy. Very rare. Most of my conversations were, you're totally right. We agree. It's so frustrating. And that is another reason why I actually chose to resign, because when you have across the board, practically the majority of your department telling you that the policy is wrong, yet you are still choosing to not shift the policy. To me, it was very clear that the policy was being run by 4 men. And to me, that's so un-American. It's so not democratic, right? It's not how we're supposed to run. That's another reason why I chose to resign, because in those conversations, it was clear that even very senior officials weren't able to really affect change on the influence on the policy.
And what kind of conversations that you were having with your peers in terms of anger or in terms of disagreement or in terms of dissent? What were you saying about the Biden administration? What were you saying about Netanyahu's government? What were these conversations like?
Well, I can tell you this, that before I resigned, few people spoke openly with me about the policy. There was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of...
There's a lot of fear.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Again, something that in my 18-year career I've never seen. A lot of fear.
A career first for you.
It's a career first. It's unprecedented in my personal experience, where people are literally scared to talk to each other because they don't know how the person's going to react. They don't know where they'll land on this policy. But the reason why I gave this as a preview is because after my resignation became known internally, before it became known publicly, and I was still working in the department for a couple more weeks, so many people reached out to me. People that I hadn't even worked with reached out to me and said, we agree with you completely. We're so frustrated. This policy is so inhumane, but we don't know what to do. We can't resign. Can you please speak up on our behalf once you resign? All of this. And I'm like, whoa, it was actually quite overwhelming, because the overwhelming part was the fact that these people had been quiet beforehand and were only comfortable enough sharing these thoughts after they knew I had resigned.
You were no longer there.
Well, I was no longer there, and I wouldn't be a threat in terms of people were scared. What would others say about them? Would other people say, oh, this person's against the policy, what is that going to do? People are scared of retribution. They're scared of what are the career implications if they're not willing to play ball. I became sort of known as the troublemaker. I was just causing so much trouble regarding this policy that it was just almost too much to handle for some, right? So I think people that are concerned about climbing the ladder, people that are worried about their financial security, and I don't want to judge, it's a privilege that I was financially able to resign, right? But I understand very well that not everybody has that ability to do that. They have their own financial constraints or whatnot. So, but it's very telling on the policy that so many people are upset by it and are scared by it. And I have to be blunt, Mohammed, as
Yeah.
I'm saying all of this. There are a lot of people that are very willfully enabling the policy. Even people that are against the policy are willfully enabling the policy, just because they're doing their quote their job. So that's why it keeps going.
When you say they're afraid, is it more of a personal fear where they don't want to lose their job because, them having a family or whatever that they want to take
Yeah.
care of? Or is it a fear of the department letting go of them or labeling them a certain way or even, giving them a new position within the department or something? Like, where does the fear stem from?
I think it's the labeling. So, for one, it's very hard to lose your job when you work for the government. Just for anyone that's out there listening, other fellow diplomats, it's hard to get fired. It takes a long time to get fired. But what we do have in the State Department is something called our corridor reputation. And we basically get good jobs. Once you become a mid level officer or a senior officer, you get quote unquote good jobs by people recommending you, right? Other diplomats recommending you. That's how we operate. And so people are very concerned about how they're seen within the department. People are very concerned about their corridor reputation. Um, and so I think the fear stems mostly from that and from our own evaluation. So we get evaluated yearly, and that determines whether or not we get promoted or not. And those evaluations are written by our supervisors and our supervisor's supervisor. And I can tell you, I was very much threatened with having a bad evaluation multiple times through my own protest of refusing to do interviews. So I think people take career
Mhm.
considerations in terms of how vocal they are or not vocal. But I was actually just in Washington this last week, and one of the things that I shared with former colleagues and just everyone that would listen that's in the government is let's get over that fear, right? We're supposed to be a country of the people, and we are working for the government as public servants. We're not supposed to be scared to share our professional expertise. And that's why I emphasized at the beginning of the interview that it was never about my personal experience, it was about my professional expertise. And I was recording all of that for the department. So there should never be fear in sharing those valuable insights. That's why we were hired. And I think people have a lot more power than they realize in using their voices. But there's power in collective action, right? So if everyone is scared across the board, then there's self-censorship really, and the department is not hearing these important views. So my hope is, and my hope in speaking out as well, is to let people that are still on the inside feel empowered. Use your voice, use your expertise, raise the alarm, right? And do so collectively so that the department is hearing it from a large swath of people and diplomats across the region, not from just one or two or three here and there.
In your job, what kind of analysis were you relaying back to the Biden administration from the Arab world?
So with this latest conflict,
Yeah.
I'll call it a genocide. It's not a conflict. I'll be very clear and blunt about that. I began from very, very early stages writing what we called snapshots, or basically daily reports of summarizing what pan-Arab media, traditional media, and social media was documenting. And the idea was if you're going to message to the Arab world in an effective manner, you need to be able to understand what they're consuming on a daily basis. So what that entailed was, images that were going viral in Arab social media. So I would put in these daily reports back to the department images of dead babies, of dead toddlers, and it was honestly, Mohammed, like traumatic to put together these reports on a daily basis because I would gather all of this information, and then I would try to dwindle it down to, as horrible as it sounds, the most important or the ones that would make the most impact for a Washington reader. Um, and it was such a, for lack of a better word, traumatic and difficult to try to choose which image of which dead baby should I put in this report today. It was horrifying. And there were a lot of images as well of, fragments of US bombs next to civilians. And I would show, look at this US complicity. The US complicity is undeniable. Look at what people in this part of the world are consuming. You cannot send talking points would say, oh, we have concerns about civilian deaths in Gaza. Like when you're completely linking it to US complicity. So I would basically write and send these daily reports with links to every single thing. So again, it was documented. And I would also put in there how our talking points were being received. So, for example, whenever Linda Thomas Greenfield had a vote at the UN Security Council, and obviously that was seen in the Arab world, and people across the region was so angered by yet again another US veto. And I'm sure you've seen these memes that went
Sure.
with red bloodied
Yeah.
hands. Send that to the
Yeah.
department.
I don't even think that that was Arab specific, to be honest.
Oh, it wasn't. It wasn't, but it was definitely, it went viral throughout the region.
Sure. Yes.
But I was told, "Oh, you're so brave to send these reports." I'm like, this is not bravery. This is just facts. This is literally just what the world is consuming, and in particular, the Arab world. And it's sad if we're trying to hide our policymakers from this reality. This is not about personal feelings. I'm not trying to not hurt Linda Thomas Greenfield's feelings, right? She's a representative of the American people. And when she is seen as being complicit in the genocide of an entire population, the department needs to be well aware of how that's being read. Because believe it or not, there was a lot of disillusion in the department. I'll give you an example. When
Yeah.
we had the parachute airdrops, they'd be like, oh, look,
Yes.
people are going to be so happy. Look, people are going to be so happy. We're sending all this humanitarian assistance.
Wait, that was the vibe within the department or
Yes,
within the government,
yes,
that people were
yes,
going to be so happy.
yes.
I mean, that had the opposite effect.
Oh my goodness, Mohammed, I cannot tell you how many conversations that I had be like, I understand why you think this would make people in the region happy, but it is not. Hala, can't you go out on this? We're providing humanitarian assistance. Surely that should be an okay message for you to deliver. No, it's not, because we're also sending the bombs to kill these people. And these parachute airdrops are not
Yeah.
actually a real means of staving off mass hunger.
Also, it was happening at a time when Israel was banning most aid trucks from actually going in. So
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
think a lot of people were looking at this as this was America's way of saving face, and it was just doing the bare
100%.
minimum.
100%. Yes. And that's exactly the feedback that I was giving back to Washington, saying they see through this PR stunt. Everybody sees through this PR stunt. I will not be your PR machine to go and try to sell this PR stunt because it's just a stunt. If we actually cared about warding off famine, we would put pressure on the Israelis to let the humanitarian aid trucks in by the hundreds. We are not using our diplomatic leverage. Until we use that diplomatic leverage, I will not be on TV trying to sell these things. But seeing people's legitimate confusion as to why the aid drops were not a good message to tell was was very interesting. But that's why I'm telling you, like, there's also a sense like maybe people do need to tell you these basics that for us, the rest of the world sort of takes for granted. But when you are in the government, you're in this little isolated bubble and you're only hearing from other people in the government. And when you don't hear any of that critical feedback, you almost think everything is a success when it clearly is not.
You used the term genocide, so I just to be clear on where you stand today. So, do you believe that the U.S. is complicit in this genocide?
Look, I'll give you a thorough response to this because it deserves it. I I was still very much in government when South Africa brought its case against Israel at the ICJ. I actually previously served in South Africa. I'm familiar by name with all of the judges and extremely professional and well regarded, and I have the highest respect for all of those. So I read that report in detail, line by line, because I myself was trying to make the determination because it was also going to impact my own resignation, right? Other than the fact that I really wanted to know what was happening in Gaza. It is impossible, I think, if you read that report with unbiased eyes, to make the determination that it is indeed genocide, based not just on their actions, but they're obviously on their intent. There are pages and pages of notes from Israeli officials, from prime minister on down, advocating for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And this is on repeat. It's not just a one-off, it's on repeat. And obviously their policies, whether it be mass starvation or mass killings, and destroying infrastructure to the point where people are dying of just very simple infections, it is very clear that it is a policy of ethnic cleansing and intended genocide. I don't believe that the US is trying to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. I think they are willfully enabling it, right? I think the United States government is definitely enabling it because we're supplying the weaponry. I don't think is the intention of the government to commit it, but I think without us and our support, most specifically our military support, which has been unconditional practically, despite all of this evidence, is allowing Netanyahu's government to do what they're doing, which is their end goal is definitely ethnic cleansing. I do think Secretary Blinken and President Biden are trying to stop Israel from doing that. I want to still believe that, even though nothing in the policy. I know.
But just
I
on that
know. I
note, but
know.
just
I know.
I think it's because there's a clear disconnect between what comes out of the White House
Yes.
and what Israel continues to do on the ground
Yes.
in Gaza. The latest being what's been called the Nusayrat massacre,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then there's the example of the ICJ ruling that there is a plausible genocide, yet the U.S. hasn't stopped sending weapons to
Yes.
Israel. Why should anyone trust that the U.S. government actually wants to end this genuinely?
Look, Mohammed, I completely agree with you in terms of actions have shown otherwise. And this is what I've been saying this past week in Washington, right? And I had conversations. I met with members of Congress, I met with congressional staffers, and I met with some senior State Department officials. And that's exactly what I told them, that people aren't necessarily blaming Israel, only Israel, for what's happening in Gaza, but they're blaming us. And we cannot get rid of our complicity by words alone, right? We can't say, there's only a certain amount of times that you can say we care about the Palestinian people or we're trying to get humanitarian assistance without actually taking concrete actions, because we have leverage. We have leverage. Our biggest leverage is US weapons assistance and lethal assistance that we keep sending Israel. But I can tell you, Mohammed, that a lot of our foreign policy is not dictated by our foreign national or our national security interests, is determined by domestic politics. And that was abundantly clear to me this past week in Washington as I was roaming the halls of Congress. These decisions are being made by politicians. And politicians are influenced by things other than national security. I'm just going to leave it at that, unless you want to dig into that.
No, I do. I want you to elaborate if you can.
So one of the deliberations that I had for myself as determining whether or not to resign is what is causing this intransigent policy? What is making us not shift or put condition on aid? When you have such a historic and strong, quote unquote, ironclad commitment to Israel, that comes from somewhere, right? Like the pro-Israel lobby in America is very, very strong. It's been part of Washington's DNA for decades, and there's been a lot of focus on that, right? I'm going to put some focus elsewhere as well, the arms industry. And that's something that we don't talk a lot about here in the Arab world. You hear a lot about APAC, you hear a lot about that, but there's also the arms industry. And from both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republicans, our politicians receive so many contributions, millions of dollars worth of contributions from the arms industry. And so when you have the politicians that are literally the ones making the decision of whether or not to send more arms, if they're profiting from that, how is this a fair shot? How is it a fair shot? if you're the politicians deciding whether or not to continue arms transfers are personally benefiting from those arms transfers. Again, as a diplomat, I was left to think, what the heck am I doing here?
Well, that's
You
what I
know,
was going to
if
ask
this
you. I mean, doesn't
yeah,
that
if this, well, this exactly that made me also one of the many things that went through my mind and thought process in deciding to resign. I said, then literally I'm just an implementer out here. There's no sense of me being here if, particularly on this policy where there's so much influence on domestic politics that influences and just now, from my conversations this last week with members of Congress, the ones that voted on a pause of shipment got so much pushback that they're scared now to take the same decision. They have campaign ads running against them. They have millions going against them if they take a stance on this. And it's a very problematic domestic politics issue that has immense impact on how we run our foreign policy in the United States.
But don't you think that Gaza is already becoming a domestic issue as well? Because it
Oh,
clearly
for
will
sure.
play a major part in November come the elections. So how do you end that cycle?
Overall, how you end that cycle is I think we need to have campaign finance reform laws in the US, which is obviously not going to happen anytime soon because it's not to the benefit of our lawmakers to make those laws. So you almost have, this vicious cycle. But when it comes to Gaza, 100%. And I think that this administration is vastly undermining how much this particular issue will affect the polls in November.
Do you still think that they are thinking that even today?
Yes, yes. From my time in Washington, everyone was saying, we get it. We get that Gaza's horrific, but the other option is Trump. And Trump is. So there's this assumption amongst Democrats that because Trump is so bad, that Americans, or at least Democrats, won't vote for Trump, that they'll forgive Biden on Gaza. And that's not true. That's not
Yeah.
true.
Because what
The
about the
uncommitted,
uncommitted vote? What about,
exactly,
you've had
exactly.
people from the Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab community actually say that they hope Biden loses this election. So
Yep.
it's very clear that there are portions of American society
Mhm.
that are calling, they're not going to forget about Gaza anytime soon, and surely they're not going to forgive Biden over Gaza anytime soon.
I completely agree with you. The uncommitted movement was very, very powerful, and it continues to be powerful, and it continues to grow in the United States. But because there's been so much institutionalized support for Israel, I think, and pro-Israeli Congress people and senators, and obviously, all the way up to the president, I think there's this assumption that that side will win. So for Congressman Bowman in New York, I don't know if you've been following his race. He's been very, very forward leaning and an advocate of a ceasefire. He's been very strong in condemning the Israeli actions as war crimes, so on and so forth. Like, he is being devoured and pounded by pro APAC funds and all that to try to unseat him. So I think the assumption is, okay, well, when the time comes, we're gonna just do a massive pro Biden push and make sure he gets over the line. And I think for some, even for some that are very much in the pro Israel camp, they're okay with both Biden or Trump, to be quite honest. But I think not so much for the other side, right? Because I think for the Democrats that felt that they were deceived by Biden, for the communities in Michigan, and I don't want to just say Arab and Muslim American communities, because really this has become a nationwide issue. When I
Sure,
was
yes,
when I was
correct.
speaking to activists in Washington, and these are people that are leading protests and everything, they come from all different backgrounds, all faiths, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans. It has become a humane issue, not an issue of particular background. They're very staunchly against Biden. They want, like you said, they want to punish him. They want the Democratic Party to wake up. And I think as far as things stand now, unless the Biden administration really changes course dramatically on Gaza, I think they're going to cede the vote to Trump. And the hope is that the Democratic Party will have an awakening, will realize that they cannot take the left for granted, that they cannot take liberal values like human rights, press freedom, for granted that when liberals say they believe in things like human rights and freedom of press and protection of journalists, they mean it, not just in words, but also in action. And so I hope that there will be an awakening on the Democratic Party side as a result.
Hannah, I want to read you a quote. This is by a former State Department official. So Aaron David Miller, he gave an interview to the New Yorker last April. He said this: "If you're asking me, do I think that Joe Biden has the same depth of feeling and empathy for the Palestinians of Gaza as he does for the Israelis? No, he doesn't, nor does he convey it. I don't think there's any doubt about that." Now, when you hear those words from a former State Department official, how do you react?
I agree with him completely.
How much of this do you actually think falls back to racism?
All of it. Look, this was another devastation that came out of this conflict. Colleagues, friends that I work with, forget about the senior officials in Washington, even just people that I worked with throughout my 18 years, not have the same emotional reaction to the killing of children in Gaza. And that for me was such an eye-opener and it was devastating. Why are you not shedding tears? How are you okay? I am not okay. I am not okay seeing all these children get killed in Gaza. How are you okay? Is this normal for you? It's almost this expectation that people in that part of the world, oh, people in the Middle East, they just get killed all the time. There's just wars all the time. And so when I was telling you, I was sending those reports and I would send images of the dead children and I would get some feedback, but not the type of feedback that I would expect. I started to try to change my strategy. I said, okay, how can I humanize these children even more? And so then I would start putting images of them alive and the little girl, the
Really?
toddler wearing her princess dress. And I would even write commentary. I said, her name is Layla. You know, I'm making it up now, but obviously as an example, her name is Layla. Her favorite princess was Ariel. This is her pictured as Ariel. And this is her after the US bomb falls on her, thinking that maybe if they see these children alive, they would understand these are real kids. These are not numbers. These are not statistics. These are real children that are loved, that are beloved. Are you still okay enabling this policy? And unfortunately, the answer for most is yes. And to me, I think it does stem in a lot of racism. Why our policymakers are okay with it, but they're outraged by others getting killed.
But I actually want to stop right here. You know, for you to actually go to those lengths in order to talk about children that were being killed. I'm sorry, but I do want to invoke your identity here as an Arab American.
Absolutely.
How did that make you feel?
Horrified, to be quite frank. And like I said, this conflict has been so eye-opening on so many levels and so tragic on so many levels. You know, obviously seeing what's been happening in Gaza on a daily basis has been absolutely traumatic, and understanding and speaking to people that are there. And then the whole other layer of dealing with society, dealing with your coworkers and realizing it almost has shown me people's true colors, right? And I've been speaking to others who feel the same way, that this conflict has almost made them realize when you peel layers of people, you know, how are you really underneath? Do you really treat life equally? Do you really believe in human rights? Do you really advocate, you know, for the sanctity of life for children or not? Is it and and seeing that very blunt racism is also one of the reasons why I decided to resign. Like, how can I keep representing this administration? How? It wasn't possible for me anymore. And I've said this publicly in some TV interviews when I've been asked that I absolutely think it's racism. Um, and I think that it is something that we have to deal with as a nation, right? The US has refused to deal with its past. And that has had so many implications. And this is one of them. This is sort of the latest iteration of that. That's just been left to not address. And there's just some very embedded racism in the minds of people. It's subconscious, and I want to stress that, because people are like, okay, racism. Well, aren't you more scared about Trump? And I'm like, with Trump, you sort of know what you're going to get. But with the Democrats, it's supposed to be the party of liberalism. It's supposed to be the party of equality. But then you have all of this subconscious bias that actually is quite lethal and quite dangerous, because they don't even see their bias. So I had to point people's biases out to them. Do you see? Do you see how differently you react to this child versus this child? And then they're almost shocked because they don't even realize it themselves.
I want to talk to you about the shifting public opinion towards Israel. There was a Gallup poll from last March that showed that 55% of Americans disapprove of Israel's military action in Gaza. How do you think that this public opinion shift will affect the U.S. government's relationship with Israel in the future? Do you think it will?
I do think it will. I think it's shifting it now, but not enough, right? I think, you heard the president, it was, I guess, now a couple of weeks ago, come out publicly from the podium saying it's time for the war to end. Those were the first times he used those words. And I think he is feeling the public pressure. He is feeling all of the protests, these movements calling for an end and calling for a ceasefire. But clearly it has not been enough to make them take any substantive change in the policy. And so what I kept on articulating this last week is that we will not see a ceasefire until the US uses its leverage. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians, and I'm not going to say the Palestinians, actually Hamas, have any incentive right now to abide by a ceasefire that the US proposes, because we're not using our leverage. We've actually strengthened the far right in Israel, and we've given no incentive or leverage for Qatar or Egypt to use on Hamas. So it's embarrassing at this point that the president and the secretary keep using this rhetoric, assuming that it's going to change, but it's not. So yes, I do think it's going to have an impact, but not enough thus far.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned at the start of the interview. You talked about feeling that you were being treated differently because of your Arab American background. I mean, you were born in Morocco, correct, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What did you mean when you said that?
I was born in Morocco, very proud of my Moroccan heritage. But look, I have been told many, many times in my career, and many, many times in particular, since this conflict has started in Gaza, oh, as an Arab, or as an Arab American, or as an Arab woman, I'm sure you feel X, Y, and Z. No.
Right. They add a little asterisk to your identity,
no,
right? Yeah.
Not as this, not as that, as an American diplomat, right? I wouldn't say that to anyone else. I wouldn't say, oh, as this, you must feel this. No, 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 no. No. And it's almost easier for people to dismiss what you're saying based on your Arabness, right? It's easier for them to dismiss facts if they're saying, oh, she must have a bias because she's originally from here, as opposed to actually looking at the facts. So, like I said, everything that I documented was fact-based. It was analyzed, it was documented, and it was verifiable, because I wanted to be clear that this has nothing to do with my personal opinion. But even my opinion comes from my master's at Georgetown in Arab Studies, my double major in international affairs and Middle Eastern studies from George Washington, right? My assignment in Yemen, where I myself survived 3 terrorist attacks and was evacuated twice from Sana'a. My time leading a political economic section in Qatar, my time working in Egypt, my time working in the UAE, right? And living and working in these countries. So that's where my professional expertise came from. Those are where my recommendations came from. The fact that I worked on counterterrorism, on countering violent extremism, on human rights issues. But for some, it's much easier to ignore all of that and just dismiss you based on your heritage. And I was also very, very frustrating, and I actually complained that I was being treated that way, because fundamentally it's also not supposed to be who we aspire to be as Americans, right? We're supposed to be a nation of diverse backgrounds, and that's supposed to be what makes us stronger. But if we're being alienated because of that, I'm going to call you out on it.
When I hear you speak about your career and what you studied at Georgetown, and it sounds that you had such an idealized view of being an American diplomat. I'm curious, do you think about what your younger self, young Hala, who was about to graduate and go into public service, what you would have thought of your position that you're in now?
It's funny you say that, Mohammed, because I was just in Washington and I just walked by one of the dorms that I stayed at when I was a sophomore. And I was thinking, oh my God, like, look at that dorm. It looks exactly the same, but so much has passed between now and then. And who would have thought, that I'd be walking in the halls of Congress this week? Look, I'm going to be honest with you, Mohammed.
Hmm.
When I joined the State Department out of Georgetown, I had a lot of friends call me a sellout, a lot. I had a lot of friends that were like, how could you join the government? What are you doing? I was also with those exact same friends at protests all the time. I used to go on the bus from DC to New York to protest. I used to protest in front of the White House all the time. But I joined the State Department with this notion of, if you want to see change, be the change, right? Join the government and help make that change. And I actually received the fellowship to join the State Department. And the fellowship was meant to bring more diverse voices into government, more people of color into the government. And I believed in that because you need that. Our government needs that to be stronger. Um, so I can say that despite everything that's happened, I'm still proud that I joined 18 years ago, but I'm also very much proud that I resigned because I never sold out, whatever that means, right? I stayed in for as long as I thought I could affect positive change. And then once I realized that that was no longer possible, I resigned and I'm speaking out publicly because I feel like I have to. But you're right, I did have an idealized view. Some may call it naive. I think I still hold on to that, right? I still hold on to that because who wants that to be completely shattered? But
If you had a crystal ball, you don't think you would have chosen an alternative career path?
that's a really good question. I have to think about that because I don't like to believe in regrets because I feel like
Sure.
every experience that you've had in life sort of forms the person you are. But I can tell you that actually, I think I would have still joined, and I'll tell you why.
Hmm.
Because this career has opened up my eyes in so many ways. I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years working as a consular officer. That taught me so much. I lived in South Africa, heading the political economic section. I was working in the US consulate in Durban. South Africa taught me so much about the world. It taught me so much about America, sort of race relations in South Africa, and how history is also the present. South Africans to this day cannot forget the US's role in apartheid and in supporting apartheid. They don't forgive it at all. So my job was actually very difficult in South Africa. Some people wouldn't even want to open the door for me because I was representing the US government. That was so eye-opening for me, so eye-opening, and I obviously served in Yemen, which was an incredible experience. And then I went from Yemen to Hong Kong. So imagine living in Sana'a, one of the most impoverished cities in the world, and then moving to Hong Kong, which at that time was very wealthy and not all of the issues that it has today. So I'm so grateful that this career opened my eyes up to humanity, allowed me to see and understand the perspectives of so many around the world. And I think it made me who I am today, right? Because of all of that. And it was a privilege to be able to live and be immersed in all of these societies. I am able to, I think, have a more humane view of the world, and understand that at the end of the day, we really are all the same. And so, yeah, even if I had a crystal ball, I think I would have still done what I did.
When you decided between yourself that you were going to resign, who was the
Yeah.
first person you went to?
Oh, my husband, of
Yeah.
course.
What was that conversation like?
Oh, he's wonderful. I'm so blessed to have such a wonderful husband. No, he's been supporting me throughout all of this because especially when I was writing those daily reports, and I mentioned to you, Mohammed, they were quite tough to write. And, I actually wanted to many times just stop and resign even before then. He's like, no, you're making a difference. But then when he would see how much they would stress me out, he's like, okay, halas, halas, just like submit your resignation today. We'll figure out the finances, you know? No, so he's been my emotional support. And now my financial support since I'm currently unemployed. Right? So no, he's wonderful. And I hope everyone that is, having thoughts of resignation or, whatever does have that level of emotional support because it's important to be able to speak to others when you're going through change, career change or whatnot. Yeah.
Since October, I just want to ask you on a personal front. For you, had a mother of three. What were these months like before you came to the realization that you were going to leave the State Department?
Um, Look, I feel almost embarrassed to say they were difficult because I'm not in Gaza, right? I'm not suffering through constant bombardment and forced starvation. So I feel like it's an insult to even say things like difficult, right? The people that are having a difficult time are the ones that are actually in Gaza. I can just tell you that I'll just say this, it was life altering. It was life altering, right? Because I was on a particular path. Being a diplomat is sort of a career, lifelong career type of job, right? You don't become a diplomat just for a couple years and then decide to do something new. It's sort of like you're that until, you retire when you're old and gray. Um, and so it was sort of peeling those layers, realizing a lot about my own government that perhaps in my naive self I didn't want to believe, right? Um, Logistically, it was very problematic, right? Getting it all done and getting out the door. But I can say that it was also liberating. Um, it's liberating to be able to speak out completely freely and truthfully about what's happening. It's liberating to be able to help in a way that I'm not representing anyone but myself, right? So I went on the Hill, I had meetings, I'm only representing myself, I'm not representing the government. I'm trying to advocate for good. I'm trying to advocate for peace. So it has been liberating. So I'll leave it on that positive note, and hope to just try to do good in any little way I can.
And what comes next for you?
Everybody asks me that, and it's
Yeah,
almost
and I'm
embarrassing at this
jumping on that bandwagon.
it's almost embarrassing at this point that I don't have an answer, but I am honestly taking it day by day since my resignation was public. I've just had a lot of media attention, not just only American media attention, but a lot of international press as well. Which again, I found it to be quite a privilege to be able to speak out on this issue when I feel a sense of responsibility to be able to speak out. So I'm doing a lot of that. An organization flew me to Washington last week to speak at their event, Middle East Democracy Center. They had their launch last week, and that went quite well. I spoke at a couple of other places. I met with a lot of activists. So literally each day is different. And I'm just trying to get the word out as much as possible on Gaza because I really do think it's a collective effort. We all need to speak out. It's not a time to be silent. It's not a time to be complacent. And I hope to be one of the voices out there advocating for an enduring peace, and tangible steps we can take to get there. And I hope that I also inspire others to speak out. So I will keep doing that for as long as I can and people are willing to listen.
And on that note, Hala, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I truly do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Mohammed. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Hala.